Problem with Christianity.
problem with
Christianity.
Problem with Christianity.
Problem with Christianity is they just want to take the fun out of everything.
The problem with Christianity is
The
just all
problem with
it is.
Christianity is that I know Christians that don't live out what they
Christianity is
say.
that it's so
Exclusive. How can only
judgmental towards
Christians
sexual
go to heaven?
orientation.
Allow death and destruction
How can it be
and
the only
war
way?
in our world.
Would a loving God really send that many people to hell?
It's no different than Greek
The problem with
mythology.
Christianity
The Bible
is
really
you
is
can't
by God.
scientifically
How do you know
prove
God's
God.
real?
Well, howdy, everybody. How you guys doing this morning? Woo, nice, perfect. Hey, I'm going to pray because we've got stuff to do. All right, let's go ahead and do it together. Jesus, thank you so much for today. And Jesus, if I have any desire that is in me, it is to honor you in your fullness and to honor you in the fullness of how you show yourself to us. And so today I pray for just a very special time and a time of thoughtfulness and a time of passion for you and clarity in you. And so we look to you to do that. We love you and thank you so much in your perfect name. Amen. Like I said, we're getting right to business today. Now, we're doing this whole series on the problem with Christianity. And as I was thinking through this week, I was reminded and was talking with some of our staff about the challenges of being a Christian leader in the current modern climate, right? And part of that challenge is, we'll say as Christians, that we want to reach the lost, or we want to reach those who are outside of the faith. The challenge with that, in my opinion today, is that there's some bandwidth on what exactly that is, right? Or who falls into that category. And so as leaders, we have to think about that each one of those elements in that bandwidth has a different thing that we seek to speak into. And we have to be thoughtful of that. And so even for the topic this morning, I want to help you understand part of the challenge and the different kind of categories. Now, we have some emojis up here because we're emoji crazy in our culture. And except for me, I literally removed that from my iPhone on purpose. All right, but some of you love the emojis, and I thought this would be good to use the emojis to help this out a little bit so you can understand the different categories or classifications of people that churches seek to reach out to or minister to. Now, the first category that we're going to bring up here on the screen is the never connected and never believed. Right? In other words, it's people who did not grow up in a church, they didn't have any connection to church, they've never been connected, and from that they don't believe. There's nothing there. They're not necessarily hostile, they're not necessarily welcoming, they're just sort of a neutrality, or maybe they're on a spectrum of different views when it comes to Christianity, but that's one group that we seek to reach out to. The second group is a little bit interesting, once connected, but now disbelieve. They grew up in the church, they've experienced evangelicalism, and for whatever set of reasons, they've departed. And we probably all know somebody that's in that category. The third category is many in this room, connected and will always believe. And those are the people who are just like, I just simply believe in God. I've never had any doubts or questions, or if I do, they're just fleeting and they go away because in my core, I know there's something and I'm going to always be a part of things. But then there is a fourth group. And the fourth group is connected and on the edge of disbelief. And there are some in this room that are in that category. So as a pastor then, part of it is there's people you're trying to reach, and then there's people you're trying to develop, and then there are people you're trying to keep. All of that is important for what we do as a church and how we seek to communicate. Now, to give you some perspective on the people that are connected but on the edge of disbelief, I'm going to give you some simple numbers. Today, this week, 53,000 people who claim to be Christians will stop doing so in the United States this week. Every week, 53,000 American Christians disavow, drift away, decide they're finished with their Christian faith. Now, globally, Christianity is on the rise. But in our society, it's seeing something different. And when we look at some of the information about this, we look at things like the Pew Research Group or the Gallup Research Group, we find an interesting trend in what is the top reasons for why they move from belief to disbelief. In the Pew Research material, we see that about 50% of people who leave the Christian faith say they do so because a lack of belief that has led them to move away. And much of the reasoning has to do with the fact of science. Science is the dilemma. Science is the problem. If we look at a different classification in the Barna research, looking at Generation Z, which is like the mid-20s and below, what we see from people who are going off to college or late into high school and they leave their evangelical Christian roots is they say things like, you know what, I believe science refutes much of the Bible. 55% say that. 49% says the church seems to reject much of what science tells us about the world. And then 27% said the church is not a safe place to express doubts. See, it's for these types of reasons that it's important for us to do a series like this and to look at some of the problems, because one of the problems that people seem to have today, whether we like it or not, want to accept it or not, is that they look at Christians and they say, I have a problem with your science. And from that, I am on the way out the door or I've left, and now I'm in this category that we call the nuns, not Catholic, but rather checking the nun box on faith and religion. So that's why we're talking about this today. Now, I know for some of you go, this is not my thing, man. I don't have doubts and I don't need to reconcile scientific issues. And I get that, but guess what? Your foot's not one out the door. But your child, their foot might be 1 foot out the door. Or your grandchild. Somebody that you care about, and so becomes important. Now, as we dive into this topic, a couple of things I want to remind you of. First of all, we also have a podcast, The Everyday Missionary. And on the screen throughout the entire talk today, you're going to see a phone number, and you can text any question about today's topic into that number. And then tomorrow morning, I'm going to go in, answer all those questions in our podcast. It gets published on Tuesday, and so you can listen to that. We've had a lot of great feedback from the podcast in the series so far. We're going to continue to do that. So that's number one. Number two, we have an app that you can follow along in because there's a lot of notes in there that you can kind of track with. And for those of you with ADHD, it gives you something to do, which is awesome. And so all the more, it's just a tool that you can use in this process as we look at this topic today. So I encourage you to do that. Now, having said all of that, I want you to understand my approach this morning. It's a little different. Some Sundays in this series, I'm defending what Christians believe. Other times in the series, I'm addressing things that maybe Christians have mishandled and saying, here's how we can do it better. And so I kind of talk to different sides of whatever the topic may be. Today, it's kind of like I'm dealing with all of that. There's going to be some things where I'm defending the Christian faith. There's going to be other times where I'm sort of critical of the Christian faith. There's going to be other times that I'm critical of the scientific community, and then other times I'm defending the Christian community. In other words, I'm an equal opportunity offender and celebrator all at once, right? And in that, here's why I'm coming at this from the perspective I am. I've been in both worlds, personally, and I've shared that, right? I've been in the atheist world. I've been in the believing world. My wife says if I wasn't a pastor, I'd probably be a scientist, right? And so for me, I think it's valuable to look at all of it and try to build bridges in all of this, right? Because I think there are bridges that need to be built at times, and I think it can be healthy to do that. And part of that is just simply identifying problems so as to build better bridges. And so where I want to start this morning is identifying a couple of key problems. And the first one's really simple. This one is just like almost like just because there's an elephant in the room, I just want to get it out of the way really quickly. It's the first problem in your notes. And it's the problem that it seems to be in the dialogue between faith and science, and that problem is mainly about timeline, process, and occasionally climate. It's not all science, right? I say that because sometimes you hear like, Christians don't do science. Christians don't support science. I'm like, right. We look at Newtonian physics and we go, a lie, right? Like, we don't do that, right? We agree on so many elements of science. Here's the thing where it seems to be there's some debate. Right? Evolution. Or as Richard Dawkins says it, evolution. Right? So that's one area that seems to be a hot spot. The other is timeline, right? Like how old is the universe? And there's all kinds of discussion about that. And then the last one that's a hot spot is climate change. And are humans a part of the climate change dilemma? And man, there's all kinds of sides on that. I'm not getting into the sides on that. That's not my point in this particular point. It's simply to address that those are the topics that create the rift, right? And so people begin to side up over these things. In particular, people of science and people of faith, they sort of side up on these. And I think that then streams into the second problem. The first problem is those are the topics, but from that it generates a second problem, and it's the problem of the war. And the war is the war of either or, where each side looks at the other side and really says, you have to pick a tribe. You're either all this or you're all that. You're all Bible and you're all the canon of the Bible, or you're all cosmos and the process of science, and you better side up. And then when that happens, when there's this tribal war, man, you feel it. And part of the challenge in my thinking is that we live in a particular little slice of history where tribal warfare is everywhere. Right? I don't mean to push any buttons, but if you watch the news this week, tribal warfare. And you feel like, I have to decide, am I Team Kavanaugh or am I Team Ford? Am I Team Liberal or Team Conservative? Right? I mean, you just feel it. Like you're put on the spot. Decide. Whose camp are you in? Are you traditional values or are you tolerance? You know, and whose side am I on? And you better pick a side, or you're going to be ostracized by the other side or your side if you don't pick a side. And sometimes in this tribalism, there are stereotypes that are created. And the stereotypes that are created are often caricatures of the furthest extremes. But those caricatures are then floated like the poster child for everybody that falls onto either side, right? I thought about this week, and I thought, man, I'm going to go and go and do some interviews with people that I think fit the stereotypical caricatures that overstate the problem. And so I'm going to go ahead and show you those interviews right now.
Why is there a difference between faith and science? Very simple. Because people of faith are buffoons. See, I understand this very well. I wear a jacket and a turtleneck. That shows that I'm qualified in my intellectual capacity to reason through the problems of the universe and see that really, when you boil it all down, faith is silly and ridiculous. And anybody that wants to hold to faith and enter into science, well, they're not welcome. Because it is clear that they are not bringing intellectual rigor to the process of what it means to discover the natural order of things, to reduce everything down to the very beginning, and to see that nothing created everything. We don't need more belief in Zeus or Aphrodite or the Easter Bunny, and so certainly we do not believe that we need faith in God.
Faith and science, huh? All right, here's the deal. Can I tell you, here's the problem. Here's the difference between faith and science. Scientists, they're buffoons. Buffoons. Yes, you heard me right. Here's the deal. I know they get into all this stuff like square roots. The only root that matters is the root of the tribe of Jesse, who is Jesus. Aside from that, though, I'll tell you some other stuff. It takes more faith to be a scientist than it takes us faith people to be people of faith. I mean, have you gone to the museum and seen that monkey girl Lucy from like billions of years ago, right? Here's the deal. Like, they show you the statue, they show you this whole big skeleton of Lucy, but when they show you the real bones they dug up, it's like 7 bones, 3 chunks of glass, and a little bit of aluminum can in there, and they say that's where we came from. That is not science, that is faith, and that is crazy. Here's the bottom line. The way God made everything was a very short time ago in just a couple of days. Like, God rolls in one day and he's like, here's how we're gonna roll. Kangaroo, boom. Turtle, boom. Doggy, boom. Tuna fish, boom. The crazy one, star-faced mole. Yes, the star-faced mole. Because here's the deal. God that same week made stars and moles and then put a star on a mole's face. Star-faced mole. Here's the deal. The only things that God did not make in those days are A, cats, because they're of the devil, and B, scientists, because they also of the devil.
I am a thespian, all right. And therein lies the problems for me, right? There's these caricatures we believe, and if you're a person of faith, you have a tendency to think that all scientists are against you. And if you're a scientist, you think all people of faith are silly and ridiculous and buffoons, and that highlights the problem, right? So there's this tribalism and entrenching that happens in all of it, and that creates problems. And here at the core, here's what's crazy to me. If we take both groups at times on the extremes are fundamentalists. They're both fundamentalists, right? So you have fundamentalist atheists who say it's only the cosmos that can teach us all truth. And then you have sometimes fundamentalist theists who say it's only the canon, only the Bible can tell us all truth. And because they take that position for different reasons, they drive the next generation to this one singular point that says, you must decide. You have to choose. Is it God or is it science? I see this with somebody like Richard Dawkins, who so shames anybody that wants to consider faith and science that he's like, you're intellectually inferior automatically if you're willing to consider that. It's an extreme vision that I think most people don't share, but it feels like that's the way then we're viewed by the scientific community. On the flip, somebody that I very much admire, Dr. John MacArthur. I love John MacArthur. I love it when he preaches the Bible, but he'll say things like, if you question anything about 6 literal days in Genesis, you reject the Bible, you reject the gospel, and you may not know Jesus. And it's like, wow, we went really far, really fast. And so you get this kid coming out of high school, going off to college, and they're just sort of dumbfounded. Like, everybody's telling me I have to pick, I have to choose, I have to make a decision. And like I said, for 53,000 people every week, they feel like that's kind of what's been brought to their table. It's because there's this either or that just pits creation versus canon. And I think this is tragic to me. And part of the reason it's tragic is because the Bible itself advocates for a blend, right? A merging of these things. In fact, I turn our attention to this ancient piece of literature in the book of Psalms. It's the 19th chapter. And it starts off saying this, showing that it's a false dichotomy between the two. He says, the heavens, they proclaim the glory of God, and the skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day, they continue to speak, and night after night, they make him known, right? So creation declares God. He says they speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is never heard, yet their message has gone out throughout the earth, and their words to all the world. See, creation reveals God. Creation has a message. Creation has a message that we, as those who can view the creation, should work hard to go, what are the tools of interpreting that creation so I can see God? That would be the scientific method. It is a tool of interpreting God's creation to see more of God, not less of God. Sometimes there's a fear that says, man, if you get too far into science, you'll lose sight of God. No, I'll tell you what, the further I get into science, the more I see God. And I think this passage celebrates that. Equally, it goes on in verse 7, and it says, the instructions of the Lord are perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The commandments of the Lord are right, and they bring joy to the heart. In other words, as soon as he says creation has a message, he says the Bible, canon, has a message too. And we use the rules of interpretation. The fancy word is hermeneutics, but we use these rules to interpret the Bible, just like we use the rules of science to interpret creation. And all of that together shows us who God is. So instead of the either or that's about biased pitting of one revelation against another, which is what sometimes happens, instead there should be honest, inquisitive investigation that should righteously and rigorously look at the truth in all areas. You should say, no, I'm going to dig for what is real. I'm going to dig for what is true. I'm not going to let that get in the way. I'm going to be rigorous in the pursuit. Because all truth is God's truth as a Christian. We shouldn't fear that. We should look to that. Now, I think what's hard about this is that the war of our culture conspires against us, right? It conspires. And sometimes the tribes will be a part of that conspiring. So, for example, if you're a scientist and you go, you know what, I've got questions about the human impact on climate change. Your science tribe may not receive you really well. Regardless of what you're presenting or not presenting, and I'm not even arguing whether it's true or not true, and that's not my point. My point is, if you're science in the science community and you raise that question, you may get a little ostracized. Equally, I have discovered over the course of my 25 years as an evangelical Christian, if you're a Christian, you go, you know, I wonder if we can make the Bible and the theory of evolution compatible. You're sometimes ostracized and not welcomed for that conversation. It's almost like, no, we're not going to investigate, we just have to have the tribalism. And yet I question whether that is a healthy thing. Because again, what we need to kind of drill down to is saying, no, we need to always be pursuers of the truth, for all truth is God's truth. All truth is God's truth. And again, if polarization remains, we'll have no bridges and we'll have no healthy relationships toward one another, even in difference. We have to figure that out, especially as Christians. I believe it's incumbent upon us to be the bridge builders at times. Now, part of this pursuit of truth can be a little painful to me because it requires that we're intellectually honest about the problems in both camps. And so I want to talk about that. And I'm going to start actually within the scientific community. Some of the problems for the person that says, I choose science over faith. I want to talk about how then from a Christian perspective, how we sometimes struggle with that tone and that kind of disposition. In fact, I have a handful of things I'm going to just rush through really quick. None of this is like heady science stuff today. It's more just kind of practical, personal things. So for the person that says it's science over faith, as a person that loves science and loves faith, I respond and I say, well, sometimes you're asking for as much faith as my faith asks of me, but with less reward. Right? And maybe that's a little bit what it is. So in other words, it's like faith, but you don't have the reward of heaven, and it's faith, and you don't have the reward of the same kind of community when it comes to belief and values and that kind of thing. So, because again, even as we learned last week, part of what's true deep into the innards of an atheist worldview is there is no purpose and there is no real meaning, and it's just all kind of an illusion for survival. And I'm like, man, that I don't know if that's very meaningful. Because at the core, you're asking me to believe that nothing created everything. That was last week with the Twinkie, right? We got to the mystery of a Twinkie over 13.8 billion years. And there's all these layers and stages in that, and all these things that just had to happen just right. Billions, trillions, tens of trillions of variables in there, and it brings us to the point where we can look at a Twinkie and go, wow, who puts that in their mouth? But from that, I go, man, that's a lot of faith you're asking of me to believe. All those things just luckily happened. And so there's a faith quotient that's in there, right? Or you're asking me to have a lot of faith when it comes to things like morals and beauty and love and how those all came to be, because it seems like that's a lot more complex than it would just sort of spontaneously happen under the right conditions. And so part of that is saying, man, you're already asking me for my faith. I want to make sure then if I'm having to place my faith someplace, there's something of deeper substance for where I'm placing it. So I acknowledge when I was in my atheist state, right, as an adult, loving on my science, me being one of the 53,000 that said science is a big dilemma with faith, there was still this part of me that could look and go, yeah, but it takes a lot of faith to believe that. That was still true. I still knew there was gaps. And so that's a problem. Sometimes, and maybe closely linked to this, sometimes you're as fundamentalist as a fundamentalist, and that limits unbiased investigation and turns off learning. If you're familiar with the word paradigm, it came from science. It's the idea that says you get so entrenched in an idea that it's hard to make a shift, paradigm shift, because the idea is locked in so much. That's originally a science idea. And it was interesting, just this last summer, there was this new discovery in genetics where it was Mark Stockel and David Thayer. They made a pretty startling revelation that 9 out of 10 current species are all connected genetically and only goes back about 200,000 years ago. Right? So massively upended a component of evolutionary theory. These are not Christian guys or anything else, but they came to this conclusion. The science to them was irrefutable, but they were nervous to publish because they're like, this has faith implications. I mean, the science is there. Something happened 200,000 years ago that was real dramatic, and everything's connected to this point now. What do we do? And they even admitted that, like, we just, there's implications that we didn't want to really kind of reveal our data. We kept looking at it in disbelief and saying, it can't be. Why? Because they were preset in a fundamentalist mindset, but they finally went ahead and published the data, and people are like, yeah, that's really good data, and kudos to them for taking the risk because they knew it was a shift. And it may not be well received within the community because even within the scientific community, there is sometimes a fundamentalist approach that limits some investigation. The next thing is that on occasion, you state science that proves or disproves things that are either open-ended, has gaps, or is outside of the scope of science, right? That's true. So if Richard Dawkins says, science has disproven God, I'm like, where's your peer review paper on that? There's no peer review paper. It's just in his opinion. It's disproven God because that's his opinion, right? But he states it as a fact. Or they'll say Darwin's theory is settled fact. Now, I'd say there's some things about it that are really solid, and there's some things about it that have a lot of holes and gaps and questions and everything else, and even that research that was released this summer upended a pretty good chunk of something there. So we can't just say it's all settled. We could say there's some things that it seems in this direction, if you want to say that as a scientist, and there's other things we're uncertain of, and there should be that honesty that says we're uncertain. We're still learning to discover what that is, right? And then sometimes, as somebody may be a non-science person, you look at some of the stuff that's put out there, and then you feel like, wow, there's a lot of assuming that goes on in that. In fact, this week there was a new release discovery of a new dinosaur, largest dinosaur ever discovered. This is an artist's rendering of that right there. And so I'm like, this is a really cool article. I'm going to read about this. I love paleontology. This is fascinating. Let me see the skeletal outline of this whole thing. And I was like, well, that's unrewarding. I feel like I'm playing like paleontologist operation, like oh, there's like 7 bones. Okay, cool, whatever, and it's from that you go like, that's like 8% of everything there. Like, there's a lot of gap filling that goes on to say, this is what it looks like, Now, I'm not trying to say that isn't reasonable or it's not accurate, but you gotta understand, for people that are non-science people, they look at it and they go, really, that's it? I remember when I went to the museum and I saw Lucy, and there was this whole skeleton. I'm like, wow, they got a lot of components. They're like, well, no, the dark ones are the actual bones. I'm like, well, that's hardly anything. There's a lot of reconstruction, right? Or if you love looking at all those pictures of NASA where these amazing cosmic clouds with all this color, you're like, look at how beautiful it is. It's like, yeah, but a lot of that's Photoshop colors. I'm sorry. Some of you are like, no, they are not. No. You're like shocked by it, but we're doing a lot of Photoshop colors to help us see all the different layers that are going on with matter and gas and everything else. But still, there's a lot of that gap filling that goes on, and it makes you feel like, hey, is this the full story? Like, that's maybe where sometimes Christians may struggle. But then another thing is something that's important for science to realize is that sometimes you see things that reinforces our faith. It doesn't refute it. Right? There's areas that we go, man, well, that kind of is a substantial thing for faith. I was having a discussion with an atheist recently online, real good conversation, and he's like, there is no scientific proof that faith is real. And I said, well, let me give you some examples where I think it can. So one was all about mental health. And when we look at the data on mental health, we find that people who take a personal faith seriously seem to have lower rates of depression and lower rates of anxiety and things like that. And I said, you got to admit, at least, whether it's just belief in a make-believe friend called God that keeps you a little bit more mentally above water in life, the stats sort of show that from research. That's at least a positive toward the idea that faith is reasonable. Or longevity. Time magazine just put out an article this last year talking about people that are committed to their faith and faith communities live longer than non-faith people in their communities. Or the more we look at the universe, the more we're finding all this intricacy and everything else. I had a discussion with another atheist this last year about a recent discovery in physics, and he's like, that disproves God. And I'm like, how? And he's like, 'cause. I'm like, but you're calling it the God particle. It's funny that you took his name for it, and there's a lot of mystery behind it, and I think it actually subsidizes the idea that there's a God. More intricacy that we can't explain. Or even in things like biology or DNA, where we're like, wow, man, it's like a book with only 4 letters to write everything. It's impressive. The more we look at that, in fact, the head of the Human Genome Project is a Christian. And he had been an atheist, and he came to his faith in Christianity again because in part of his research in genes. It's like, this is way too intricate and detailed. This is like an awesome coder at a computer. There's more to it than I can imagine. In light of that, I'd say that science is just as capable to grow faith as it's ever been to challenge it. And that's where I think sometimes then as Christians, we need to kind of realize that too, and have a little bit more of a willingness to be enthusiastic about this topic than to be concerned by the topic. And therefore, I want to speak really quick here to the faith person over the science person, right? So the person says, no, it's all faith more than it's about science. Here's a few things to my own tribe. First, we have to realize that not everything nor everyone has an anti-faith agenda in science. Not everyone. Now, I get it. Your kid goes off to college, and they're going to have a college professor, and that college professor will, day one, say, if you're a Christian, I'm here to mess with your world. That has actually happened. Yes, that is totally true. But that's not true all the time. In fact, when we look at information again, when it comes to actual researchers in the research field, about 40% state that they are people of faith in the scientific research disciplines. That's a high number. You would never think that. People are like, oh, it's got to be like 2%. 7%, 8%. No, it's like 40%. There's a large number in that. So, man, they're there, right? But here's what I also know. The people of faith in those research fields, or people of faith in scientific endeavors, they sometimes feel like they're between worlds, right? So they know that within the scientific community, they may be looked at a little sideways for their faith. And they also know in the faith community, they might be looked at a little bit sideways for their scientific work. An example of this is who I just mentioned, Francis Collins, right? So does the Human Genome Project, teaches a Sunday school class at his Christian church, but he believes in evolution. And so people are like, well, I don't know what to do with that guy, and he feels like he's between worlds. Or just this week on Fox News, I actually saw an interview with a lady. It was really fascinating. Her name is Catherine Hayhoe, and she's a climate scientist who is an outspoken evangelical. She's like, I'm an evangelical, I believe in the Bible, everything else, and I also believe humans are contributing to climate change. And part of the article was how she gets death threats from Christians about her views on science. And she's an evangelical Christian, like, sorry, we're going to kill you. It's insane, right? And so sometimes there's this between worlds reality, and we need to realize that maybe we shouldn't always be so polarizing. The next thing I think we need to realize is that ideas such as evolution or an old universe or cosmos are not automatically anti-Christian. I think everybody agrees that God made things look old biologically and connected, and we just have to be kind of warm to the reality of that. What I mean by that is I think every Christian I've ever met says, well, I believe in microevolution, right? But maybe not macroevolution. Like, okay, but we got it figured out. That's why there's so many dogs in the world, right? Like, we with all that diversity, we feel like some mechanism is in there, right? I say that because here's what I've noticed in my Christian life. People will say or think, they hear the word evolution and they think it's a synonym for atheism or a synonym for naturalism. Evolution is just a mechanism. It's just this mechanism that plays out. And as a Christian, I look at whatever happens at this DNA level and I go, I don't know what all's going on, but that mechanism relentlessly seeks life. Like, that sounds like a God thing to me. The relentless seeking of life against all conceivable odds and all this diversity. It's why we have so many types and styles of dogs, right? There's not the kind of diversity in cats intellectually. They just hate us. But dogs are all over the map, right? And again, it's because we think there's something that's unfolding in all of that. And so we have to kind of realize that it's not inherently like that, right? That's important. And I think maybe in this too is science, its job is to simply look at the creation and do its best to interpret it. And as Christians, we believe, however you think, whether you think God did it a few thousand years ago in 6 days or you have some other view, we all agree he made it look really, really old. Right? So if we didn't have page 1 of our Bible, there might be the reality, we'd be like, it looks really old, maybe it's old. Like, we would probably look at it that way. I'm not saying how old, but we'd probably look at it more that way than any other way. And so I think that's where we just have to realize, like, man, if somebody's coming to the equation and they don't believe the Bible and they're just trying to look at the facts, what are those facts showing them? Now, it's incomplete still, with lots of gaps and lots of holes and lots of questions. But it's gonna understandably cause them to go, trees are old and stars are far away and light travels at a speed and that makes it look old. And I think we can appreciate how they're looking maybe at some of those things. The other thing we have to understand as Christians is that knowledge doubles every 12 to 18 months. And so some of our arguments may be outdated. If you're using evidence that demands a verdict from 1983, it might be a little outdated, right? Because there's been a lot of things that have been discovered. And I think many of the most recent discoveries, in my personal opinion, subsidizes God, does not take away. subsidizes that he is there. The other thing I would say under this is, again, with the odds of our kids growing up and leaving the faith because of an incompatibility or assumed incompatibility, all the more, at least as parents and grandparents and people in the church, we should care enough to say, I should probably have some reasonable explanations and some reasonable things to drive them forward with, and not just simply say, no, and it's bad, and don't, and ignore it, right? We have to bring maybe more to the table. The last thing under this I'd like to say is realize that when it comes to Genesis, in particular chapters 1 through 11, because it's kind of its own thing, and then chapter 12 starts with Abraham, there are various positions by Christians who believe in a literal and inerrant interpretation of the Bible. There's just different views on this. This got lost around 1920-ish, when the real sharp war began between kind of the evolutionary idea and the Bible idea, and then that kind of raged for a long time. But if we go back in history, like 1,800 years ago, 1,700 years ago, 1,500 years ago, we see people like a guy named Augustine, or a guy named Irenaeus, or Justin Martyr, Fox's Book of Martyrs, that guy? Justin Martyr, Origen, these Christians who looked at Genesis 1, and they did not see those days as literal days. And this was far before science and Darwin and evolution and all this stuff. They just looked at the text and they saw different challenges with it, and they didn't know what to do with that. So kind of an example of Augustine. He looks at how God says, Adam, on the day you eat of this tree, you will surely die. But Adam didn't die for almost another 1,000 years. And Augustine looked and said, either God's a liar or a day is something other than a 24-hour period. That was his struggle. He's like, it can't be a literal day because then God promised something and God's breaking a promise. And if God breaks a promise at the very beginning on the first page, how can you trust any other promise? So his conclusion was, well, later in the Bible it says a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. Therefore, that day was maybe 1,000 years. He goes, in fact, we don't even quite know what these days were in a timeline. We're just kind of guessing. I highlight that just simply to say that before we had our modern debates, there was debates and question marks and concerns and uncertainty. Even in the recent world, B.B. Warfield was a guy that was a contemporary of Darwin, and he was a guy that totally defended the inerrancy of the Bible. And yet when he read Darwin's book, he's like, I don't see why that would be incompatible with the Bible. He just was like, I could see both working in unison. But he was a stalwart of believing the Bible. Tim Keller, the Gospel Coalition, R.C. Sproul, all these people go, we're not quite sure what to do with the literalness of Genesis because nobody quite faces it totally literally. Nobody believes God said, man, after 6 days, I'm tired. I need a rest. Right? So there's now, again, do I firmly believe that we should treat Genesis in a literal interpretive fashion? Yes. What I'm uncertain of personally is if that requires our questions being applied to it or the original Israelites' questions being applied to it, because they're very different. Right? I've used this illustration before. If a 5-year-old comes to their mommy and says, where do babies come from? And the mommy says, from a mommy's tummy. That is literal for that child. That's a literal statement to what that kid is asking. If a 15-year-old comes and says, Mom, where do babies come from? If they're asking by 15, you have other issues. But aside from that, mommy's tummy is not the question being asked. Right? It's a different kind of question. So you approach it literally from a different point of view. So part of this is just even understanding. There can be differences in how that is understood. Now, again, I'm not contending for one over another right now. That's not my heart. My heart is to say, perhaps humility and room for discussion and discovery and maybe not drawing hard lines all the time on everything may be a wise move forward. In fact, that leads us to this last point, moving from either or into and. I think for Christians, we need to move from either or into and. First reason I say this is Jesus didn't call us to make war, but he called us to make peace. When Jesus sent out his disciples, he says, go into a house and bring your peace upon it. And if it receives that, awesome. And if doesn't, he doesn't say, give them the bird and kick sand in their face and be angry at them and create a war. He says, let your peace return to you and move on your way, shake off the dust, and go to the next one, right? He's like, you don't have to be like, oh, we're against that group now. He says, just peacemaking is the mission. And that's what we need to be about. The second thing, I think it's important for us as Christians to always be people of truth more than we're people of positions, right? Jesus dealt with in John 8, where he says, you know what, if you really investigate the truth, it's going to set you free. And the religious leaders of his time said, but we already have a position. We're of Abraham. And Jesus is like, if you're going to take a position, you're never going to see the truth. And that was exactly true. As the chapter unfolds, they miss all of that. Sometimes having this need for this entrenched position causes us to be blind to the fullness of the truth. And so we have to be aware, we have to be humble, we have to be constantly asking and seeking and asking the questions that inform us. And I would say on this topic, it means that we need to look for God equally in creation and in canon. We have to look for God in both. And the reason I say that is because it is a mandate of the Bible. It's a mandate. Genesis chapter 1, God said this, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of him, he created them male and female, and then he blessed them, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion. That word dominion doesn't simply mean reign over it. It has this idea of understand it, unlock it, harness it. When somebody goes into a science field, an engineering field, a technology field, a mathematics field, what they are doing is learning the tools to unlock the mysteries that God has had us born into. And he's like, go do that. That's what I want you to do. It's when you learn how to harness that, you're even more creative. And we see that. So much creativity is born out of understanding God's creation. So it is a mandate to be people of both the book and the world. The same thing is true in Romans chapter 1 talks about those who don't even know God as far as being Christians. It says they know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the sky and the earth. Through everything God has made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so that they have no excuse for not knowing God. See, in theology, we say there's two forms of how God reveals: the book and the cosmos. And here he says there is a deep embedded message into creation, and it testifies of God. And here's the thing will surprise some of us, especially the I believe and I'm not tempted to disbelieve people. Believe it or not, some people will believe more in God, not from this, but from all of that. And some people are going to come to Christ because of all of that more than this. In fact, I read you a quote. This is from Anthony Flew, who was a remarkably outspoken atheist. But toward the end of his life, he said this: science as science cannot furnish an argument for God's existence, but there are items of evidence that we have to consider in this book that he had written. The laws of nature, life with its teleological organization, and the existence of the universe can only be explained in the light of an intelligence that explains both its own essence and that of the world. And then he concludes with this: my discovery of the divine has been a pilgrimage of reason, not of faith. But imagine if somebody went to Flew and said, sorry, unless you see it exactly this way, you need not apply. No, for Anthony here, it was the cosmos that pointed out God to him. And so we shouldn't try to protect faith from science. We should equip faith with science. We should equip it. It was interesting sitting down with my college-age daughter last week. She was in town from WSU, go Cougs, and she is in the STEM field, science, math, that kind of thing, technology. And we were talking about science and faith, and it was interesting because she was baffled by the idea that somebody couldn't make some of these things compatible, because the way we raised our kids was saying, hey, there's compatibility, right? And from that, when she sits in a class and some professor tries to say they're incompatible, she's like, that's not true. I grew up learning they're compatible. You're nuts. In other words, what we did is how we raised our kids is we stripped the opposition from the capacity to make her question her faith because we equipped her with the science that shows it's compatible with her faith. And so she's just not tempted by it. Even my unbelieving son, his disbelief is not a science one. He's like, no, I see faith and science. They work together great. It's completely different reasons. See, this is where I go back to we need to equip, we need to invest, we need to share. And so with that, I'm pretty excited about this. This is something our leaders as a church came up with months and months ago. It might have been close to a year ago, roughly, maybe just late 2017. But we have this whole mission for the good of the city. And we want to disrupt stereotypes. And so we were sitting around, we're like, hey, what could we do to maybe do this a little bit differently and do something that our community wouldn't expect? And so we came up with a scholarship. Right? And so it's in the fields of science and engineering and technology and mathematics, and we're like, hey, we want to make sure that this is understood. Now, here's how we did this. This is a scholarship that's going to be open to the Riverview School District, right? So a senior that's pursuing any kind of degree in one of those 4 fields, this is a scholarship they can apply for. Now, this is a scholarship. It's not like you have to be a Christian to apply for the scholarship. This is to our community for the good of the city. On top of it, we as a church are not making the decision on who wins the scholarship. We're saying, hey, we trust our community to make that decision. We simply want to get behind the idea that science matters. And we as Christians care about that. And so it's a group of people. We can have one of our people on that group of people, but we're having an outside group make that decision. And because we want to be a little bit clever and scientifically savvy, the scholarship amount is $3,141. For you math nerds, you're loving it, all right? Because here's what we believe. We believe that we are here for the good of the city. We believe we are here for the good of the society. We believe we're here for the good of the future. And we believe that science is not incompatible with faith, but rather faith and science can work in tandem. Let's go ahead and pray together. Jesus, thank you that you made all things. And thank you that you've given us mental capacity to research all things. Now may we see you in all things. May we keep digging for the truth in all things. May we not fear the truth in all things, because all truth is your truth and all truth points to you. May we be objective and may we be heartfelt in your name. Amen.